Hello, I'm Lisa Harrison, and today is the 24th of January 2012. This is my first interview for the year, and it does feel very right, the timing feels right, to be speaking today with Franco Collins, the founder of Ucadia.org. Now, for those of you who are familiar with that name, you'll know that this is a special opportunity, as Frank rarely speaks outside of a weekly talk show program. Now, whether you know of Frank's work or not, I do suggest you get a pen and paper ready, as you will probably want to be taking notes. And with that, I would like to introduce and welcome Franco Collins. Hello, Frank.
Hi, Lisa. How are you going?
I'm really, really well. And I'm very excited to be talking to you today. You know, I've been pushing for this for some time.
Sure.
I'd like to start by actually saying that looking back over 2011, it really was an unprecedented year in the sheer numbers of people who became informed, I think, about the fraudulent, illusory nature of the global structure that we live in. You know, the banking and economic systems in particular, but what is also loosely referred to as the straw man movement.
I agree.
You know, it was huge. And today we're going to cover off just a little bit because this is, you know, it's a vast topic.
Sure.
But we want to get into a little bit about how that happened and hopefully where it's going and how it plays into this rather auspicious year of 2012. So what I would like to start with today really is the information about that is most relevant to us in the here and now, and the understanding of how this global structure came to be and how we became these corporatized, owned vessels, really. Now, for those who are listening, if you don't know what that means, don't worry, you will before the end of this talk. Now, for me, Frank, from what I've understood through studying on Ucadia and talks with you, that began with a pope several hundred years ago. If that's a good place to start, then let's go from there. Who was he and when was it?
All right. Well, I guess what we're talking about when we talk about the popes or the Roman pontiff is we're talking about the group that claimed to be the heads of the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church in Rome, in the Vatican, which in reality was a hostile takeover and outmaneuvering of the Catholic Church by a group that had nothing to do with its foundation, and this was in the 11th century. So we're talking about a group that I call the Roman cult. And the reason I call them the Roman cult is threefold. The first is that I want to make sure under all circumstances that anyone that was brought up a Catholic or a Christian clearly sees that we're only talking about a handful of people, and this has nothing to do whatsoever to what your beliefs are, or, as I say, whether you're born up a Catholic. The second is to identify them very much as to where they're based. They're based in Rome. They think totally different to general men and women that live around the world. They're a cult. They're a secret occult group that live within an organisation. They hark and get their orders from Venice, and their history goes way back to the breakup of the Khazarian Empire and the Magyar that took over Venice. And the third is that what they did to Catholicism was infuse us with the third age of Mithra. And the Mithraic religion in Rome was in fact called the Roman cult. So it's a fairly apt term. But the Roman cult, as I say, took over the Catholic Church and were not its true founders, and have functioned very much in the form of parasites by presenting a facade and really operating in complete opposite to what they claim to be.
So just to clarify, the Catholic Church was founded on religious and spiritual values in the beginning.
Absolutely. And it was founded by a group that really took this very, very seriously. The group we're talking about are variously known as the Pippins, as the Carolingians, and we're speaking of the Franks. Charles Martel, we're talking about Charlemagne, we're talking about a group that are the epitome of what we would consider the good Christian knight if we went and saw the film Kingdom of Heaven. We're talking about the Knight's Knight. And these people founded the Catholic Church in 741 and then captured Rome in 751. And on Christmas Day, the first Pope, Catholic Pope, was crowned in Rome. Prior to that, there was absolutely no Roman Pope in Rome. And they founded it because they were Christian and they had pledged their allegiance to Constantinople, a city that was actually properly named Antioch, and the name was switched. And when Antioch, or Constantinople, had been taken over and corrupted by a fellow by the name of Leo the Isaurian, who was really Leo from Athens, they were so disgusted that they founded a church to bring back to the roots and the intentions as we read the Gospels, as we expect people who claim to be Christian would live, and that is according to a moral code in the belief of the teachings of the historical teacher Jesus Christ. So
those who infiltrated in the 11th century and took over the rule were actually part of a Mithraic cult.
Yes, they were, and the way to view it is that the group that took over in the 11th century and installed their first pope, their first Pontifex Romanus, which was a corruption of a pagan position, a position that harks back to the days of the pagan Roman Empire. They took over because they were funded by the richest family in the world at that time, who were the former exiled leaders of Venice. And Venice was an absolutely pagan city that had been founded by a group called the Magyar. And the Magyar believed in a religion called Menashism, and Menashism was occult. It was all about spell, curse, power, and the belief that those people who founded it were the chosen people, not of God as we know God, but of a demon, of a head demon, who is variously known as Azazel, Sabaoth, Beelzebub, Satan. That's who they saw themselves as, and still do.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So they took over, and they saw this as a great opportunity, because what the Carolingians had done, what the Pippins, Charlemagne's grandfather, had done when this religion was formed, is that they had given life back to Rome as an idea. Rome had been totally and utterly destroyed in the 5th century by two major sieges which then resulted in Rome being dismantled almost stone by stone. And as a result, the survivors no longer lived in Rome at all. Rome had become a ruins, a ghost town. And the survivors created villages on the outskirts of Rome, and these were famously called the urbs, from which we get suburbs.
Oh, okay.
So this is well known in history. This was well and truly in the history books until they decided to remove it in the 20th century, because people just weren't interested in anymore in the history. So this was well known for hundreds of years, that Rome had been destroyed. And because Rome had been destroyed, the claim that the Christian church was founded in Rome is an absolute and absurd joke. And again, people knew this to be a joke, but they couldn't do much about it, because the Roman cult controlled the most powerful armies in the world from the 13th century right through to the present day. But the Pope you're referring to is a fellow by the name of Boniface VIII. And Boniface VIII ruled from about 1294 to about 1303 as one of the popes of the Roman cult. And his contribution was a document that was called Unum Sanctum. That's UNAM SANCTAM, Unum Sanctum. And this document is historic because it is the first document recorded where there is an express trust claim for the entire planet, with the Pope effectively claiming to be king of the world, and we are considered creatures. It's worth going and reading this document. If you read the last couple of paragraphs of the document, is an absolutely horrifying and astounding document. But this is the creation of the first global trust, in which we are considered creatures and the Pope is claiming the entire world.
So, as in law today, when a claim is made and it stands unrebutted or unargued, then it stands.
Absolutely correct.
So, what you're saying here is that there was a Pope who just made the declaration that he owns the world and everybody and everything in it, and nobody argued, therefore it became law.
Correct.
Why didn't anyone argue? What was it done secretly? And if so, how? Or was it just done in such a confusing way that no one understood what he was doing?
I think it was a bit of both, really. I think it was a bit of both. Plus, you've got to remember that society was more locally focused, and at the time it would have been seen as about as outrageous as someone claiming to have in their possession a covenant for one heaven, for example. It would have been considered so out there that most people would probably ignore it or discount it.
So with our more sort of galactic universal view right now, it's like someone saying, "Well, I own the solar system," which is outrageous because you couldn't possibly. So, okay, I get you.
And there are people who are making those claims today.
But how? I mean, where would you actually make such a claim? Like if in today, here and now, we would go to a court to put something like that in to make a claim like that. Where and how would he have done it in, the 1200s?
Well, the way it was done, there were three things that they did, which have a long history. The first is that all law is considered auricular. That means all law is considered spoken, and this is a rule that is unbroken and accepted by every society from the beginning of civilization. Whilst we live at a time now that it seems that all law has become written, the reality is that only when words are spoken is the law present. And this is something that in the time of the Roman Empire was acknowledged, in the time of every subsequent empire is acknowledged, at the time of the Roman cult is acknowledged, and even the courts up until the recent few years have acknowledged that the law is spoken and that written documents may be considered evidence of a fact or evidence of an act, but ultimately it's when we speak that the law is present.
So he would have only had to state this with several witnesses or something.
Correct.
And it was
correct.
done.
That was the first. And of course, before the concept of a will, as that the writing of a document became more important than the speaking of it, the nobles, and prior to the nobles, the Roman elite made their will for their future heirs a spoken event, and it was called testamentum, from which we also see the word testimony. Mm-hmm. And that was an event that was witnessed by a minimum of 5 people, and usually some kind of official who would then record it as an event, memorialise it as an event, and that was the way in which one indicated how their estate was to be split up after their death. The other thing that they did, and this probably for some people will appear to be distasteful, it's extremely distasteful, is that the Roman cult practiced the dark art of writing spell and high curses on human skin. And human skin had two names. The first one was vellum, a Roman word that means skin of an animal or a kid. And the second was parchment, a word specifically created by the Roman cult as to the authenticity of the material as being correctly created for the purpose of curses. And in the
was
high...
Unum Sanctum originally written
on human
on
skin?
skin?
Yes. So when you see...
Distasteful, yes.
Well,
Oh my goodness.
usually children. And
It gets worse. Okay.
when you see, and I'll explain to you why, in fact, the modern concepts of documents today all hark back to this basic principle, and you'll see in a moment how this can be proven by several things that we still do today. But when you look at any papal bull published today, every single one of them is a fraud, and every single one of them, if you even see them written, certainly from the 17th century, they were written on parchment, they were written on human skin. Those documents must still exist, and they have hidden them away from us. But I just said I'd give you proof that this can be proven just by rituals today. When we speak and we give life to law, but the reason that paper or documentation was not considered the law is it was considered dead. In other words, when one writes words on some parchment, it is considered dead. There is no life to it. But the Roman cult used its high magic and its black magic to, in fact, create a document that had life, that had spirit, that had personality. And the way they did that was to curse the spirit, usually spirits of small children, to imbind that spirit to the document and thus give life to the document, perpetual life to the document, spirit to the document.
I see.
Now this was carried on later and was seen in the use of blood on documents and blood seals, and in fact on high documents that were sealed by sovereigns, the most important documents, up until the 18th century, the sovereigns were expected to shed a little bit of their blood for the seal, usually in a thumbprint, for the highest documents that were granting life, because when blood is spilt onto parchment, then the sovereign is giving life to that document, literally.
Yep.
And of course, that was replaced with red ink. And the notary seal is another example where paper is risen by having the embossing, and when paper is risen, life is given to the paper. So this all comes back from this concept that unless the paper is given life, unless it rises from the dead, then it is a dead instrument having no life.
Right. So when you see all those ancient, when I say ancient, older documents that have got the red wax, the big glob of it, raising up off the paper and then stamped, that's what that's doing.
This is where it all comes from, that writing was considered a dead medium, and what those that were obsessed in black magic came up with was an argument on how to convince people that if the paper of the medium itself was the skin of a child or an enemy, then their document had life. And if their document had life, or highest life, then no other document could compete, literally could compete, no matter what it says, because those documents did not have the same standing, the same life, the same spirit as those. And that's why they created papal bulls, so they could not be out-argued.
What's the definition of a papal bull?
An instrument issued by one of the popes of the Roman cult from the 12th century.
So here we have Boniface, who has this document, Unum Sanctum, written up on human skin, declaring that he owns the world and everything in it. Then what's next? What happens next?
Well, what happens next is that we move forward to the 15th century after Venice has solidified its position, after the private company created by the Venetians, known as the Holy See, has now been put in place since the 13th century and doing very nicely for them. We now move into the 15th century where they create a concept of the testamentary trust and the concept of estates. So now we're at a point where they're ready to consider the cone shell game that we view today of corporate trusts, corporate structures, estates, and so on, where things are owned within one trust, then another trust, then another trust, like Russian dolls. And the first of those was called Romanus Pontifex. It was a papal bull issued by Pope Nicholas V in 1455, and it's only one of 3 papal bulls ever to have the statement in the what they call the incipit, which is the opening line, for a perpetual remembrance. In other words, a testamentary trust was created. And Romanus Pontifex was the testamentary trust of the Roman pontiff, which claimed the world under unum sanctum that Boniface VIII had done, but now put it into a testamentary trust, much like one bequests their will for their heirs and successors.
Okay, it's just I don't want to lose anybody here, so I just want to recap again. So Boniface creates unum sanctum,
which is an express trust. He's basically
trust?
Expressing it.
Yes.
There's no legal mechanism to say how it carries to the next pope. He just makes a statement, I'm the pope, I own the world, and you're creatures. And no one rebuts it.
And in between that time and, did you say 1500?
1455.
1455. They corporatize the church, the Roman church.
Well, the Holy See was a private company. It's never been owned by the members. It's a private company owned by Venice.
Right.
So the whole Roman Catholic Church is a private company owned by the Venetian noble family. It always has been.
And then from there we start to get these other trusts coming in underneath.
Correct.
The express trust of unum sanctum.
Correct.
Okay. Now, what was the purpose of the first one, this Romanus?
What Romanus Pontifex did is that it identified that the Roman pontiff is the supreme head in the world and that all land is claimed by that trust, all land, and we are considered, by virtue of being born from the land, to be fixtures of the land, to be considered. They created a word actually in order to describe us. They couldn't describe us directly as cattle because that would be obvious. So they changed it and they called us chattel. So we were created as chattel to the land, that is property of the land. So whoever owned the land owned the chattel, and we were considered chattel.
Which is that saying in effect that they own our bodies?
Oh yeah, we were completely owned. Romanus Pontifex is a claim of ownership of the master. It's called a master trust. It's a master testamentary trust which claimed the world formally in a legal structure that then allowed franchising and licensing and so on from 1455, and we are chattel. We lose any legal rights. We have not had any legal rights in the world, in the Western world, from pre-1455. From that point on, we're considered creatures, or worse. We're worse than creatures. We're now chattel property.
Okay, moving on. What was the next trust?
Well, that created the base, and that went well for them. They didn't get anyone really objecting to that. So they moved to the second trust, which is also the basis of the second crown of the tiara, the triple crown that the pontiffs used to wear up until the last 3 pontiffs. And the second crown, the second trust, was called Aeterni Regis, Aeterni, Regis, Regis, which simply means eternal crown, and it was founded by Pope Sixtus IV in 1481. And what that did was it renamed us for the purpose of managing the property. It called us infants. So it was the introduction of the concept of parens patriae, which is actually one of the most important concepts for most countries, where the executive government of a country claimed to rule the country for our benefit, much like a parent manages the affairs of the family, with us being infants. So that was created, and that also created a very important franchise, the first franchise in history. And by franchise, I mean license to do something that would otherwise be considered immoral or unlawful. And the first franchise was what's called the Crown of Aragon. And the Crown of Aragon went to Spain and eventually became the Crown of Spain. And then after about 1605 became the Union of Crowns under King James, and it became the Crown of the Commonwealth. And that crown has remained pretty much in England up until recently.
So what if the first one gave them ownership and rights over our bodies? What effectively did the second one do?
The second one pretty much gave them control over our minds.
Okay. So they therefore dictate what we can and can't think, and how we can and can't think about it.
Absolutely. We are presumed to be without mind. In fact, if you live in a modern Western city, then you almost certainly live within some kind of council precinct.
Mm-hmm.
And if you live in a council precinct, what do they call those different divisions within a council? They call them something that starts with W. Same as a hospital.
Wards.
Yeah. And if it's a ward, then a ward only applies to a hospital. What they did was effectively they made us, under the laws from the 1870s, they made us outpatients of a mental hospital. We are outpatients of a mental hospital living in wards.
And we're not in our right mind or in our own mind.
We are not in our right mind. Well, you think about it. Who in their right mind willingly goes about their day after day, as a mindless slave that work their entire life so that a ruling elite can do physically no work and then be cursed for their entire life, see only a fraction of the energy that they generate, and then to have all that taken away from you in an instant if the ruling elite need to reset their system. Who in their right mind would be so weak, so sheepish, so stupid?
So because they made all these claims, because they've basically said, we own the world and everything in it, and you're too stupid to object, therefore you're not in your right mind, and we own that too.
Sure. Because you haven't demonstrated a mind. I mean, what demonstrates a mind when people find, no offense to the Kardashians, but the Kardashians more important than what's going on the ground in Africa with the latest famines in Somalia? I mean, what does that demonstrate? That clearly, in that one instance, shows complete incompetence. What mind is demonstrated when the latest guru comes along, and if they're loud enough and if they're brash enough, they say, don't go to court, ignore it all, follow me, pay some money and I'll help you. And they go that way rather than, for example, read Eucadia and actually read the canons, even though it's all been there for quite some time. That any behaviour like that demonstrates stupidity, and it's stupidity, is proof that people don't have the right mind. No offence to them. I mean, This is not me judging. I'm merely reflecting how the system uses our behaviour as justification for what they've done. And sadly, in many cases, they're right.
Well, anybody who's been to court and been at the the wrong end of the stick of that, which is most people who have been to court, will know that. I guess the reason they can put us into jail is because they own our bodies. If they didn't have that claim in the first place,
Well, these
they
are all,
really
yeah,
couldn't do that, could they? They couldn't incarcerate us.
correct. But these are all presumptions. But then, I've heard, I don't know how many times I've heard this, but I've heard this far too many times, where people have said, well, I've heard X, Y, Z, and they said to do this, and then I combine it with, Fred over here, and then I've heard a bit of your stuff, and so I went to court and said I'm a sovereign, and they ignore my rights, and you think, well, what did you actually think would happen? Like, you've gone and listened to a handful of people, you've done no reading, you've mixed messages, you've thrown everything in the kitchen sink, and you think, because you've done that, that the court's going to look at you and say, oh, okay, I'm terribly sorry, sir, everything's fine. The law is deliberately occult. And as we talk about these things as foundation of the law, it should become apparent if people have never heard of these things, then clearly the law is occult. The law is occult, and by occult I mean it is hidden knowledge. But the law is not impossible to decode. It's not impossible to become competent in knowledge of the law. If the court and the court procedures is almost entirely based on presumptions, then it follows that one must systematically and competently rebut the key presumptions. Yes?
Yes. So let's just try and tie this in a little bit more in terms of we were with the Vatican and now we're kind of in court. Now, we are told that there is a separation between church and state, but from my understanding, it's really this Roman cult and its presumptions are the basis for all law that is expressed in court. There is no separation.
Well, there's only separation of function. But when they say separation of church and state, they're merely saying that a judge has no right to interpret theology in court. And a theologian has no right effectively to be presuming how a judge should function in procedure. Even though they are more senior than that judge, they should defer to the private bar guild who have the license to do this, to then work out how the court runs its procedures. That's the separation of church and state. Everything is under control of the Roman cult, but separation of job means a judge does their job and the priests and theologians do their job.
But it looks more and more like that it's the same job.
It's the same system. There was one more trust I'd be remiss if I missed it, because there are three. We've done one for the body, one for the mind. What's the one you think we're missing?
Spirit.
Yep. So the third one came in 1537 after Martin Luther had started his rebellion. And Pope Paul III created it. And we are told it was called convocation. We can't be clear on it because it was supposed to be the bull that created the Council of Trent. But this bull laid a foundation that then we find reflected, and people will find this very, very difficult to comprehend because it actually goes against what they were taught. But it appears this bull is the foundation for the creation of a thing called Sestake V trusts under the Sestake V Act of Henry VIII of 1540. And these are the trusts that have been in place ever since, and these are the trusts that are created when we are born.
So this is where the birth certificate comes in?
This is exactly when the birth certificate comes in, yes.
Okay, so talk a bit about the role that the birth certificate plays, its significance.
The significance of the birth certificate, and there's probably no other document that I know of that has more functions attached to it and claimed than the birth certificate. And in truth, the birth certificate does perform a multitude of legal functions. But at its heart, it is the modern version of what is called a settlement certificate. As a certificate, we are given equitable title. That is why it's called a certificate and not a notice or some other document. It's called a certificate because we are granted equitable title, not original title. If we were granted original title, then we would not be granted the document in the form it is. We are granted equitable title, equitable use of a name that our parents gave us, which their system claims as ownership. And that document, which is the birth certificate, is the modern version of what's called a settlement certificate. And settlements was a system born out of the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, where the poor were required to have documentation, and if they were not part of the land, eventually they were shunted into workhouses, and they became known as we know them today as the paupers, the P on your passport. Your P on your passport matches your birth certificate, because if you have a birth certificate, you are born a pauper. You are born one of the disenfranchised.
So just, again, recap. This birth certificate basically gives us a temporary, possibly, right of use of the body.
Of the
and
name.
the name.
Of the name. The name represents a corporate property, but yes, it gives us right to the name. And your birth certificate is, and used to be, a passport. It gives you the right to travel within the boundaries of the estate in which you live. In other words, you can go from one suburb to another without being arrested, even though you may not have any legitimate business in that suburb.
As long as you've got the birth certificate.
Correct. That was your passport. That's right. That was the original passport, because you were a member of the poor.
Right.
By being poor, that means you have no assets, even though you're supposed to have assets. They take them from you. And it means that because you have no property, you are, under their system, able to be arrested and put in prison. It also means you have no standing. You have no standing in their system.
So you're a vagrant, really.
Well, you're one step from a vagrant, yes. Now, the only thing that they've done is that they've given you what you think is a domicile. That is an address, a residence, yes?
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that residence is not a residence in the classic sense of a place that you live in part of a village or a community as a few hundred years ago. Your address is a system established by statute, recognised under commercial law as a position in a warehouse. Your residence is the location within a giant warehouse whereby they claim custody of you because you have an address.
So this is why people now are, when called by the police or pulled over, they say that they live under the stars, they live in their skin, they don't give a physical address.
If you give a physical address, then what you admit is, under Roman law, that your mind and your soul is already in custody. The only thing that is not yet brought into custody is your body, which they then have, under letters of marque, because police are private militia, the right to arrest the body and bring it to the magistrate's court before the magistrate that is claiming the executor powers of your estate, to then work out what they want to do with the body.
And they can do whatever they wish.
They can do whatever they like. Of course they can.
So, well, I want to talk a bit because there'll be a lot of people here who are hearing all this for the first time, I know. So, you have to look at it. I'm going to put it in my simple understanding, right? That we're talking about corporations within corporations, umbrella corporations that own other corporations. So, for those of you who don't know, the Commonwealth of Australia is not a country, it is a corporation. And correct me wherever I say anything wrong, Frank.
No, you're on the right track, absolutely.
A subsidiary of that corporation are all of the states. I'm going to speak for Australia here, but the same goes for America and Canada and other countries that are part of the Commonwealth, right?
Yep.
So New South Wales is also a corporation, which is a subsidiary of the Corporation of the Commonwealth of Australia, as are all of the police forces, as are all government, so-called government departments. And the analogy that I use when I'm trying to explain this to people, and you can tell me whether or not this is one that's on track, is that I use McDonald's as an example. McDonald's is a huge global corporation, and it has its own rules, its own in terms of what its employees can and cannot do.
Yeah, policies.
Policies. Yeah. So McDonald's has its own policies. Now, who do those policies apply to? They can only apply to the employees of McDonald's. They cannot be enforced upon anybody else. And the same goes with the Commonwealth of Australia. What it calls laws are not really laws, they're just policies, and they can only apply to employees of the Commonwealth of Australia. Now, let's say, for instance, that McDonald's comes up with a policy that if you're on the premises, you have to wear a hairnet. Well, again, it's only the employees that have to abide by that policy. But if McDonald's decides that they're now going to employ a security firm to stand around inside the store and make sure and enforce that policy, that's what we would now call our state police force. They can, again, only ensure that the employees wear these hairnets. But let's say McDonald's then decides that it wants to make everybody who walks onto the premises wear a hairnet. As a non-employee, it's completely my choice as to whether or not I want to wear a hairnet when I walk onto the premises, or I can choose to leave.
Well, let's me. You're absolutely spot on, but let me fill in a couple of gaps that maybe can help in terms of context from what we have been speaking about, the master trusts, to the segue of how and when and why Australia became a corporation. Do you mind if I just quickly fill a couple
in? By all means.
Firstly, where does the word corporation come from, and how does a corporation, for example, relate to a trust, like the testamentary trust we mentioned? Under trust law, if one, and you can do this on paper or do it in your mind, draw a boundary on a piece of paper on the outer edge and call that the trust container.
Mm-hmm.
And then within the trust is another box that you can draw in that box, and it is what's called the trust corpus, the trust body. And so, in fact, in trust law, you have the word trust corpus. Trust corpus is also called the body corporate, or the body of the trust, and it is the accumulation of property of the trust. The trust cannot exist unless there is some property that has been conveyed to it by intention. Yes?
Yep.
That is the very definition of a trust. That property is called the body corporate or the trust corporate of the trust. And so that's where the word corporation comes from. So every corporation belongs to a trust. Now, another way to describe the body corporate and the trust corporate is by a particular type of body corporate. So this is now a legal description, a fiction created by law to describe that body of property. And that label from the time of, again, the time of Henry VIII, is the word called estate. And the word estate is a way of describing the body corporate or the corporation within the trust. And it's used because it then divides the property deliberately into two categories, into what it's called real property, as in land, as in chattel, and personal property, as in effects and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the context of how a corporation relates to a trust and how an estate relates to a corporation as it relates to a trust. What happened was this. Trust law was running along fine. They're making money, but they weren't making as much money as they could.
When you say they, are you talking about the Roman cult again?
Ruling elite. Yeah, the ruling elite were making money. The banks were making money, but they weren't making as much money as they could. And what they came to realize is that they were only, when we think of money, we think of monetary notes, we think of currency.
Mm-hmm.
It dawned upon them at the beginning or the end of the 19th century and then well and truly into the 20th century that in effect not only could bills of exchange and checks and currency and bills of lading and all the other things be used as collateral and therefore used as types of money, but a whole range of things could be used as collateral and types of money. And they wanted to extend that. They wanted to grow that because they wanted to make more money. They wanted more control. They wanted more profit. They wanted the slaves to work harder. They were just being greedy. They were just being absolutely classic banking families. So what they did was they created the securities law in America and the model of securities where every country was bankrupted in the manufactured Great Depression, and those countries then agreed under the terms to register themselves as a corporation and therefore from that point on trade with other countries not as estates but now as corporations of part of this global monopoly game. And this is the monopoly game that now runs the world, which is the US securities system from the 30s, and Australia is registered as a corporation since the 30s. And because of that, a whole range of documents that we deal with on a daily basis have been securitized and have been bought and sold as securities in the various bond trading markets in Chicago, New York, and in London, and the rest of the world. So when we are born, a bond is created, and that bond was aggregated with other babies' birth, and they were sold by the Commonwealth of Australia Corporation. They were securitized. They were given what's called a CUSIP number. And the same applies when people now go to court. If you go to court and you are charged with some matter, particularly if it's a serious matter, certain bonds will be issued by the court, and those bonds ultimately, if it's a serious enough matter, will be given a CUSIP number, and they will be aggregated, and they will be sold as assets of the subsidiaries of the Commonwealth of Australia Incorporated for money. They will make money out of crime.
So just to bring this down into really simple terms,
Mm-hmm.
every person, every human being, I should say, that lives within Australia and has either a birth certificate or has become a citizen, citizenship papers. I'm imagining that they've probably got the same value in terms of their value to the government. Is considered an asset of the estate of the corporation of the Commonwealth of Australia just the same as someone's jewellery collection would be their personal assets of their estate.
Yeah, let's make it simpler. Have you ever seen the film Logan's Run or any of these films where people have a bar code stamped to their neck or a chip inserted in their arm or some other thing, right?
Yep.
Okay, the only thing that's missing is the bar. The only thing that's missing is the chip. You are the legal property of the private corporation known as the Commonwealth of Australia, registered in the District of Columbia in the United States. You are the property of that corporation. You are owned by that corporation. That private, and I say the word very carefully, that private corporation.
So who owns these corporations that we think of as countries?
Well, the ruling elite.
So how does the third world fit into this, or countries where a birth certificate is not issued? And
Well, they're trying to extend it to the third world, but really the value of people in the third world from the perspective of the ruling elite is not that high. Because you've been educated, you see, think of you as yourself as being, in their eyes, as being nothing more than a robot, yeah? Just something that potentially can produce things for them, that produces energy for them. You're like a smart battery. You ever see The Matrix?
yes.
Yeah, well, that's a public notice. That's the ruling elite giving you public notice as to what you are to them. So, but you're a smarter battery than that, and they haven't got themselves to that level. If they could, then that's probably the way the world would look under their system. You're pretty much an energy battery, and they've invested a lot of money in how much energy you can produce because you've gone to school. But in the third world, they've pretty much written off the third world because it's too difficult, because it's hard to police, because there's a lot of investment and so on. They still get so much out of the Western countries, industrialized countries, that up until now they haven't really bothered with the third world. The third world is really just to shift things around where the first world no longer can be effective, price effective.
Mm-hmm. So let's just go into how people can see this in their own lives.
It's pretty obvious.
I know it's obvious. But like your birth certificate, your driver's license, everything that you receive
open your
from
passport.
Exactly.
You have a P on your passport. That means you're a pauper, you're a peon, you're a prisoner, you're a slave, you're considered a lunatic, you're nothing, you're a battery. You're a battery hen of energy. That's all you are to them. And because you're happy to be that, and because, most people don't care to read or don't believe this, most people, look, there'll be people who listen. A good portion won't believe it, okay? Therefore, reinforce the ruling elite in saying, good on you, you've just self-selected yourself, congratulations, you're still a P. You're still a pauper because you've shown you're a lunatic. Others might get really frustrated by it and say, I want to know, but can't be bothered learning. Congratulations, you've reinforced yourself again as a P, a pauper, a slave. You're just another peon. And then there'll be a small portion, sadly, a very small portion that will hear this and go, I don't actually want to be a slave anymore. I don't want to be a battery. I did see The Matrix and I know what it means. I actually want to wake up. And then they'll go, hopefully, on the journey of learning. But the evidence is overwhelming. It's all around us. Of course it is.
Because most people just have not made that connection yet, that the names of corporations are always in capital letters.
But I'm not too sure if they don't know. Look,
well, it was a shock to me when I first found out.
I remember how nice life appeared to me growing up. I grew up in a quite comfortable home, and so I was very blessed by that. And I look back at that and think, why didn't I take more advantage of how comfortable that life was? So I frequently look back with rose-colored glasses to my childhood and think, wow, if only life could be as simple as that. So I don't really begrudge anyone who, like that character in The Matrix, just wanted to be put back into the Matrix. Remember
Yes,
the traitor?
one who wanted to stake.
Yeah, just wanted to. And a lot of people, unfortunately, do fit the profile of being traitors because really, at the end of the day, they just want to go back to the way things were. They may have been a successful small business owner that got absolutely slammed by the ATO, the Australian Taxation Office. And so all they really want to do is just go back to that life if they could. And others similar. I don't begrudge that. I don't begrudge that because the system is in fact geared to prove the falsity under the illusion that ignorance is bliss. The
Mm.
system is designed to actually make that perversion look as if it is a true statement of fact. But the consequence of a system that has treated us like mushrooms, where the rich have ripped off untold amounts of wealth from us and burdened us with debt, is the present world we live in, where the system is literally falling apart every single day. And the consequence for us, if we don't wake up, is truly horrific, because it leaves the ruling elite only one option if we are not willing to come up with some credible alternative and actually stand our ground. And that is literally to press the button to reset the whole damn thing.
Haven't they tried to do that before? I mean, or haven't they done that before? Don't they have their own? The Roman cult has its own cycles. I mean, we're talking about 2012 being the end of many, many, many cycles, but the Roman cult has its own spiritual or occult cycles that it lives by as well, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And we're right in the middle of it. I mean, 2012 is a Roman date. You can't get any more central than that. I mean, when people think of 2012 and they think, well, what does Rome think about it? Well, 2012 is in Roman time, so that tells you how serious they view this because it's their time system.
Well,
But
what does 2012 represent to them?
well, it represents one of two things. Either the world will demonstrate a renewal and people will wake up and there will be a change and there will be a competence, in which case that is the mandate that is the justification for the world to evolve, or the mass of people will show themselves in the eyes of the ruling elite to be unworthy because they want to remain as ignorant and stupid batteries, in which case that will be the justification for ultimately pressing the ultimate button.
So hang on, are you saying that the Roman cult has known, they would have known for many, many years, that 2012 represented a time when humanity had the opportunity to wake up and step up, and if we did, they're prepared to step back and let go of what they've worked for all of these
Well,
hundreds
that
of
would be the
years?
fulfillment of all prophecy, but one way or the other, it's the end of the world, isn't it? I mean, it's either the end of the world
It's
in an
either the end of
evolution.
theirs or the end of ours.
Sure, it'd be one of those. That's the only two choices there are.
But they're not going to just let it all go like that, are they? Wouldn't they? They're going to go down fighting, surely.
Well, it's totally in our hands. I mean, at the moment, and you're right, the number of people waking up is unprecedented. But we're talking about a fraction of society. Like,
Yeah, I know.
look, tonight, how many people in Australia tonight know that they are the property of a private corporation known as the Commonwealth of Australia, registered in the United States? And how many of them would actually care? That's the real scary part if they found that out. Well, the answer is less than 1% no, and if they were told, probably less than 3% would care. Well, that's not enough to save the world. That pretty much means that 97% of those that are the ruling elite call them the useless eaters. That's what they're called,
Mm.
useless eaters. The useless eaters will condemn us to the other option.
So when you say the button, what do you mean?
I mean, every single tool of Armageddon. every tool of Armageddon.
Okay. So what about from a more, well, because you've referred to this year as Armageddon. I know I've heard you say that before.
Well, it's a year of
The
divine
apocalypse.
judgment. I mean, it's a year of judgment where people, I mean, really, people have the choice. It's not saying that that Mr. and Mrs. Average that lives anywhere in the world has no choice. They have a choice. But if they show, look, how many forms of public notice do people need to be told that you pretty much exist in the system as a battery, as a source of energy? If you're not willing to wake up, if the thing that you're obsessed in is, more online porn, more drugs, you don't care, then when the vast, vast majority of people show that level of moronic stupidity, base animalistic stupidity, then, it's like an election. If the overwhelming majority have spoken, then that's the mandate, isn't it?
Mm.
It has to be. And people can say, oh, but they didn't know, they weren't told. I mean, I'm not here to support the ruling elite, and I'm not here to justify their behaviour, and I'm certainly not here to argue that the legal system in any way is functioning according to law. It's not. It's abhorrent and all those things. But there are certain principles that the ruling elite present that are very difficult to argue against. And one of them is, if people have been given the choice, as they have with the internet, to learn so much, and yet they want to live their lives as fat slobs, and really that's what we're talking about, obesity epidemic of people wanting to be fat, stupid slobs in the world. If that's the overwhelming majority, well, that's a mandate.
Then you don't have the right to decide your own fate.
You have the right to sign your own fate, absolutely. And everyone does. But when you're talking about the bigger picture, the problem is that we have a huge rump of humanity that would rather be pigs in a barnyard. And I can't say it any other way. That's how they want to live their life, as pigs in a barnyard, with a TV and a fridge.
Let's say that there is at least 1% of people hearing this who do want to learn more and do want to change it. What's the first step? Obviously going to ucadia.org.
Well, to read. Yeah, I mean, please go and look at Ucadia, but there's plenty of information out there to become competent. I mean, it is a touch and go issue this year and the next as to how the die will fall. And I'm not predicting one way or the other, because I have no right to predict and I have no right to judge. I mean, even though it might appear that I'm being harsh by using the descriptions I'm using, I'm actually just being honest as to how people appear by virtue of their actions, how they wish to live. But if 1% of those that hear this give a damn for themselves and for the future of anyone that they care about, then they would actually start to read and become competent, and not just go out there and get angry and man barricades and raise up their hands, but actually become really effective by learning how the system runs, and then by learning how they may play a critical part. That's about the only thing I can see that can turn the tide against what seems to be an inertia towards our own doom by our own hands.
If anyone doubts that the Roman cult are living by cycles, and that they see this year as the end of a particular cycle, wasn't World War II also the reset for a cycle?
Of course it was. Absolutely.
So explain that. Explain that a bit.
Well, the cycles of World War II came about from, there were a number of astronomical events that went from effectively 1930s up to 1939. They were not as significant by any stretch of the imagination of the astronomical events that have been occurring in the last few years, and indeed this year, where many believe that we are viewing the end of thing called a precession of the Equinoxes, a cycle that goes for just under 26,000 years. So to the Roman cult, these times represent major seasons and reset. In World War II, it was regarded that the timing corresponded to the cycle in the heavens. It also corresponded to prophecy that had been raised through Fatima, and it also corresponded to leaders in power that viewed it being the end of the world, literally, from the perspective of the covenant of the chosen people. That is, the prophecies of a group called the Ashkenazi, or the Knights of the Flame, that had written into their prophecy that a time would come where 6 would be sacrificed. They had interpreted that for 100 years of 6 million, but there was no evidence that it had to be 6 or 6 million. And that if that sacrifice and that period of tribulation, which they saw 1260 as being days, not years, then they could return to their homeland, which is a place that they never really lived in anyway, because they're not from Palestine, they're from Mongolia and the Kazakhstan and the Caucasus Mountains, but that they could form their own homeland, which ultimately became the State of Israel. So all of that was embedded within the planning of World War II. And it was extraordinary events. In fact, there is evidence on a site called ONE-Evil that shows the foundation of the Pentagon on September the 11th, 1941, I think it is, September the 11th, 1941.
Yes.
Corresponded to the foundation of the death camps into a 300-mile wide pentagram. Both of these are pentagrams that both faced true north and formed a perfect square that created an enormous Masonic symbol in the Northern Hemisphere.
That's at ONE-Evil.org.
And you see the Vatican Jesuit Holocaust about what took place in World War II.
Yeah, I've thought for a very long time that the establishment of Israel was one of the many end games for World War II. That was planned. There was no way that there was, in hindsight, an apology at the end of the day, which we were kind of told. And also, let's go into a little bit about the monetization of sin.
Sure.
Because I think that if people could look at the courts of, when you go into a courtroom and you see a judge and you see the pomp and the ceremony, it's not much different to going to church on Sunday.
Well, the ceremony of going to court, and I'm going to run out because I've probably only got about 10 to 15 minutes for this time, and if we miss things, we'll have to do it for the next one.
Okay.
But the concept of monetization of sin, which effectively is a concept of guilt. So this is a very, very important issue. I mentioned that the founders of the Catholic Church weren't the Roman cult. They were a group called the Carolingians, or the Pippins from France. Mm-hmm. And when they created what they believed was the root true nature of Christianity, they also reformed the law, and they called that sacré loi, or sacred law. And so within the sacred law, they identified the importance of honour, and they returned to the concept of honour price. And honour price is a very, very old concept that dates back to the Celtic Empire, which is the idea that when to end the concept of an eye for an eye, which was considered abhorrent and what was called blood revenge, mm-hmm. that people would pay a fine for the injury. So this was considered a step up in civilized law, that rather than people basically going outside and chopping your arm off because someone had their arm injured, that you would actually pay a fine. Well, they restored that. When the Roman cult took over, they didn't replace sacred law, they hid it, but they introduced a new type of law they called Salic law, which means salt or sea. And under Salic law, instead of us being considered men and women that were of honour, that could demonstrate honour, they automatically considered that we all were guilty. All of us were guilty.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're guilty and you go into court, if you don't have honourable as one of the praenomens, one of the titles to your name, when you go to court, automatically you're in dishonour. That's what it means. There's only one
So there's
person
only
in the
one person in
court.
the courtroom who is in honour, and that's the judge.
That's right. That means that you must be guilty, you must be in sin. It's that simple. I mean, the rest is pomp and circumstance. It's that simple. You walk into court and you are not considered honourable and you're not functioning under sacred law, you're under Salic law, then you are under guilt.
So in the same sense that you're born in sin, according to Scripture, then you're guilty when you walk into a courtroom.
Well, sin is the 13th century concept they invented. And sin basically means you are disinherited. That's what sin meant legally. You are disinherited.
Okay.
You lose the right of inheritance through dishonour. And guilt actually meant gold. That's the definition of guilt. Guilt meant gold. So what they did was, instead of you having the right to argue, they took away the right to argue and simply said that if you go to their private guild, because it was always private, from the 13th century into the present day, the Roman cult, the first thing the Roman cult did was privatise the law. And they handed it to private guilds, in the first instance of judges and notaries, and then later those private guilds became the bar society in the 19th century.
So when you walk into a courtroom, you're walking into a private...
You're guilty. Bang, that's it, game over.
But you're walking into a private...
Oh, absolutely. It's a private meeting. There is no public law under the bar. That's a complete and utter lie.
Which I guess is why we no longer have trial by jury. And
well, trial by jury, the reason they can get rid of trial by jury is that, yes, it's all under administrative law, and there is no criminal law as we know it anymore. It's all done by administrative law. And the reason that they've done that is, remember I said to you that they're making so much money out of bonds?
Mm.
There is one problem with a bond. You have to have mutual agreement of a bond. You have to agree to go to prison for 10, 15 years. You have to agree to be tortured. If you don't agree, the bond has no effective performance. So when you have all these criminal cases with enormous potential injury, in other words, big bond potential, you can't issue a bond under criminal law. It has to be done under civil law, commercial law. So they function under commercial law, under the guise as criminal law. And the big difference with commercial law is this. Under criminal law, in the old criminal law of estates, they had to prove a thing called mens rea, which is guilty mind, as well as actus reus, which is guilty act. Two components for any criminal conviction. The act must be demonstrated as being guilty, and the mind must have shown the intent, knowing that you knew the act was unlawful.
Right.
But under civil law, there is no mens rea. There's just only actus reus, guilty act. So under civil law, it doesn't matter if you didn't know that it was a crime. It's irrelevant.
So
it does not matter.
Ignorance is not bliss in this situation.
Yeah, they could write a million statutes you've never heard of and charge you on these esoteric statutes, which, by the way, they're doing more and more.
Yeah. We probably commit crimes every day that we don't know we're doing.
Sure, but that's now because all crime is commercial and we're slaves. We're paupers. We're property. We're batteries.
Yes. Okay, Frank, I know you've got to go, and I really do appreciate the time you've given me today, and I'm hoping that we have opened some eyes and got people to do some thinking. And if you really do want to learn a little bit more about this, and hopefully a lot more about this, then I do recommend going to Ucadia, which is ucadia.org. There is also One Heaven, which is one, O-N-E, hyphen, heaven.org. And for the darker side of things, there is also one-evil.org. Is there anything else that you can recommend in terms of people doing their research?
Oh, I just think competence is really, first off, is starting to wake up.
Yeah.
So tonight there's some pretty full-on things we said. Maybe that will cause people to wake up, maybe it won't. The next step is starting to read. And the third is realizing, whilst the system has the narrowest of remedy, and one might even argue that there is no permanent remedy, and there really isn't, there are a number of things you can do that can certainly forestall, delay, and in quite a number of cases actually remove some of the torturous things that they do against you once you are competent, only once you are competent. So if people listen to this, and I hope that the next time we talk, Lisa, we can now move more into the types of remedy and the types of help and the types of things that people can start to consider if they are becoming competent with the law.
Just getting back to actually where we started this morning with the whole idea of this Pope coming out with these papal bulls, making these claims and having them stand unrebutted. And essentially our whole social structure and legal structure has come down from that, right?
Yep.
What if I understand what Ucadia is, then Ucadia is actually it's replicating that in a superior way and then presenting that and saying, if you can't match or beat this, then this now stands.
Precisely.
And is it also a matter of getting out of one system and into another? Or what is it?
No, not really. You don't have to. It's actually less work than you think, but it requires one thing. You need to be prepared to wake up, and you need to be prepared to read and address these things. If you're prepared to do that, then everything starts to click. And the hard work in terms of restructuring foundation, restoring the law, is something I've been working on for 25 years with Ucadia. And that's well on the track, well on the way.
So by each of us as individuals standing up and actually rebutting these claims, do they, and I know that might sound really, really simple, that all you have to do is stand up and rebut their claim. In reality, there are many steps to that and much learning. But do they have a comeback at that point? I mean, if you are completely competent in what you're doing.
No, they don't. And there's one more thing which you have touched on at the end here. I didn't mention Ucadia. I didn't mention the fact that Ucadia is there underpinning restoring of the law. What is Ucadia? What is its structure? We spoke very much on the problems, the issues, and the present system. And the reason I didn't cover those things in this conversation, it's too easy for people to feel that they can flip from one system where there are problems to a greener pasture, and that by simply flitting to greener pasture, all their problems are solved. No, they're not. If you're incompetent in this system, you're not going to be competent in the Ucadia system. So it's only when you are prepared to be competent and stand up that everything that is happening with Ucadia gives strength. But as far as tackling these big issues like the papal bulls, like the corruption of the law in the Roman system, Ucadia has been designed to effectively rebut every single point of power and control of the ruling elite from the very, very beginning.
Hence it's taken 25 years.
Hence it's taken so long. But people need to be competent coming to this, because we need heroes, we need teachers, we need people who are willing to show action and not be those that still want to reset the button and go back to being batteries.
Yes. Well, Frank, I hope that we can do this again soon, because there's so much more to talk about.
There's lots and lots and lots, Lisa. But look, thank you for the opportunity, and I hope you get some good feedback, and I hope it helps people when they hear what we spoke about.
Lovely. Me too.
Okay.
Thanks for now.
See you.